Outside one of the most expensive hotels on Bali, a taxi sits idling, unable to leave. In its trunk is a heavy suitcase. The passengers who loaded it promised to come right back, and then they vanished. Within the hour, police will open that suitcase and find inside the body of a wealthy American woman from Chicago. And not far away, on the same island, are her 19-year-old daughter and the daughter's boyfriend. How did a family dispute at a luxury resort spiral into something like this? Why didn't the case close after 1 year, or even after 10, despite passing through the courts of 2 different countries? And who gets arrested in midair more than a decade later? Let's start with that. The morning of August 12th, 2014. The St. Regis Bali Resort in the Nusa Dua area is one of the most expensive resorts in Indonesia. People come here for the quiet, for the white sand, for service that anticipates a guest's wishes before they're even spoken. In a sense, what you're paying for here is reassurance. In a place like this, nothing bad could possibly happen. A blue taxi at the entrance is waiting for a young couple. They have loaded a large travel suitcase into the trunk and asked the driver to wait, saying they'd step away for just a moment and come back for their things. Minutes stretch into an hour, the hour drags on, and still they don't return. The suitcase in the trunk is heavy, tightly zipped shut, and little by little, the driver and the hotel staff start to notice something that makes their skin crawl. There's something wrong coming off that luggage, something disturbing. Not what you'd expect from a vacation suitcase at a resort of this caliber. When it becomes clear the passengers aren't coming back, the driver and staff make the call that will shatter this peaceful morning. A call to the police. The officers who arrive open the suitcase and find a woman's body inside. The dead woman was 62 years old. Sheila von Wiese-Mack, a wealthy American from Chicago, had come to Bali for a holiday. Just the day before, she had been an ordinary hotel guest. Within a few hours, her name would be on front pages around the world. From this moment begins one of the most infamous family tragedies of the decade, and it won't close even when everyone, seemingly, has received their sentences. But that morning on Bali, the police knew only one thing. An American tourist was dead, and the couple who had left the luggage behind had disappeared from the hotel grounds. Behind the dead woman's name lies a story of comfort and prosperity, the kind people were used to seeing from the outside. Sheila was the widow of James Mack, a Chicago composer and music educator whose name was well known in the city's musical circles. He died in 2006, and after that, the family continued to live on what remained of his career. The main asset was a trust fund, around $1.5 million. That money sustained the familiar way of life, the house, the travel, hotels like the one where Sheila was staying on Bali. She traveled often, and Indonesia was far from her first such trip. She wasn't traveling alone. With her was her only daughter, Heather Mack, 19 years old. On paper, it's all simple. A well-off mother brought her daughter to an expensive resort to spend some time together. That's exactly how it looked to everyone who saw them at the hotel. But behind that picture were the details that would later sit at the center of the case. Heather was pregnant at the time. Her relationship with her mother had been strained for years, even though on the surface they were traveling like an ordinary family. And the gap between that facade and what was found in the trunk was staggering. A wealthy widow, a manicured resort, a mother and daughter on vacation, and a body in a suitcase by the reception desk. Investigators would have to figure out how one became the other. The first steps of the investigation pointed police toward an obvious circle. The victim had arrived with her daughter, and after the tragedy, it was precisely a young couple with a suitcase who had vanished. The question practically asked itself. But to understand what had happened in that St. Regis room, they needed to figure out what really tied Sheila to her daughter, long before this trip. The roots of all this go back to Chicago, several years before the trip, to a house that looked, from the outside, like the very picture of affluence, while inside it had been storing up tension between mother and daughter for years. They had been in conflict for a long time. According to police, patrol units had been called to the family home more than once. Arguments, mutual accusations, episodes when a quarrel went beyond an ordinary family squabble. Some of these incidents made it into police reports. This isn't rumor or some later retelling, but lines in official documents. Most often the arguments were about money and control over spending. Sheila managed the family's finances, while her growing daughter wanted more freedom and her own access to it. Where there's a large trust and differing views on how to use it, that kind of dispute can smolder for years. Heather started living on her own early. Her relationship with her mother broke down and patched itself back together over and over. Reconciliations, new fights, and around the cycle went again. Not a sudden hatred, but a long, exhausting rift between two people close to each other who could neither part for good nor truly get along. Neighbors and acquaintances saw a well-off widow and her daughter. The wealthy facade reliably hid a chronic internal fracture. Later, this whole chain of arguments and police calls would form the foundation of the prosecution's case. Prosecutors would argue that the tension hadn't flared up out of nowhere in a hotel room, but had built up over years and had a clear financial backstory. But before the conflict reached the point of no return, a man entered Heather's life whose name would later stand right beside her own in every headline. This was Tommy Schaefer, a young man from Chicago, 2 years older than Heather. They got together in the same circles where she moved, and fairly quickly things turned serious. Her mother, however, did not approve of the relationship, and that only poured fuel on an already smoldering conflict. The more her mother objected to Tommy, the more tightly her daughter clung to him. The age-old story of a parent and an adult child played out here on top of years of arguments and money disputes. In the summer of 2014, Sheila plans a trip to Bali and brings her daughter along. Maybe she hoped that a change of scenery and a trip together might smooth things over, even a little. But Heather and Tommy stayed in touch both before the trip and during it. The thousands of miles between Chicago and Indonesia did nothing to break their communication. Then comes a detail that would later surface in the case. Tommy's ticket to Bali was paid for with family money. In other words, the very funds that had been fought over for years went toward bringing to the island the very man the mother didn't want anywhere near them. And soon after Sheila and Heather arrived, Tommy himself shows up at the resort. His presence was something the mother bitterly resisted. A quiet family vacation, conceived as a way to grow closer, turns into the cramped coexistence of three people with everything strung to the breaking point between them. Arguments that in Chicago could at least be diffused by retreating to separate houses were here compressed into a single resort room and shared dinners. It's against this backdrop that August unfolds, but even before anything happened at the hotel, there was a thread Sheila knew nothing about, a series of messages that investigators would later return to. Before the tragedy, Tommy Schaefer had been exchanging messages with his cousin, Ryan Bibbs, who stayed behind in the United States. According to prosecutors, these messages discussed a plan against Sheila. According to investigators, the subject of a financial reward for help also came up. It's important to keep in mind here that this is precisely the prosecution's account, built on the contents of those messages. But in cases of this kind, a digital trail is often the hardest thing for a defense to explain away. Messages don't forget details, and they don't change their testimony. They remain exactly as they were sent. For investigators, the messages became a key link. They connected the events in the hotel room with what looked like a deliberate plan, rather than a sudden flare-up during an argument. It's one thing to have a conflict that spins out of control in the moment. It's another thing entirely to have a plan discussed in advance and in writing. Bibbs himself, meanwhile, was in the States. He never appeared on the island, never entered the hotel room, was never anywhere near the scene. But that didn't take him out of the case. If a person takes part in preparing and discussing a plan, their role is treated as part of a shared conspiracy, even if they're thousands of miles away. That's why the exchange with Bibbs would later surface in two jurisdictions at once, Indonesian and American. What began as private messages between relatives would turn into evidence that several people's fates depended on. And this detail changes the entire scale of the story. The case stops being merely a family tragedy of two women on vacation. Now the question becomes, was there a script for what happened, written long before that fatal morning? The courts would spend years searching for the answer. But, for now, let's return to the morning of August 12th itself, which lays down the first hard facts. It all came together in that St. Regis hotel room. According to prosecutors, it was there that Sheila von Wiese-Mack lost her life as a result of Tommy Schaefer's actions. By that same account, Heather was in the room and took part in what happened. These are the formulations of the investigation and the court, and it's important to keep them in exactly that status. According to the case files, the weapon was a heavy object from the room's furnishings. The particulars were examined at trial, but to understand the story, one thing is enough. That morning, the tension between all three people at this resort reached the point past, which Sheila was dead. And then came what would become the calling card of this case. The body was placed in a large travel suitcase, the very one police would open a few hours later. The suitcase was carried out of the room and loaded into the trunk of a taxi called to the hotel in advance. After that, everything matched what witnesses described at the entrance. The couple walked off the hotel grounds, and the taxi with its heavy luggage stayed parked by the reception. The plan, it seems, was this: to spirit the luggage out unnoticed and slip away before anyone suspected anything. But it all stumbled over something simple. The driver couldn't leave without his passengers and without payment, and the abandoned suitcase began to give itself away far too quickly. Police were faced with a straightforward question: where had the couple gone, and how far did they expect to get? The answer turned out to be almost mundane and far less elaborate than the attempt to hide everything. Very soon it became clear that finding the fugitives wouldn't take long. The abandoned taxi became the investigation's first thread. From her documents, police quickly established the victim's identity: Sheila von Wiese-Mack, an American tourist. Her name, her citizenship, the hotel where she was staying, the first reference points of the investigation. And almost immediately, the crucial fact surfaces. The victim had a daughter who was staying at the same hotel, and the daughter had a companion. According to staff, it was exactly this couple who were last seen at the taxi. The circle of suspects came together within hours. That same day, the search for the couple begins. Investigators have names, they have descriptions, and they understand that the fugitives almost certainly hadn't had time to leave the island. Bali is surrounded by water, and it's hard to stay hidden here for long, especially for a pair of foreigners whose documents and movements are easy to track. The fugitives really hadn't gone far. Heather and Tommy had simply moved to another hotel near the St. Regis, on the same island, in the same resort district. That largely determined how quickly they were caught. What's more, at the new hotel they checked in under their own real names. No aliases, no attempt to vanish from the system. Just an ordinary registration of two tourists. For police, who already knew who they were looking for, all that remained was to check the nearby hotels. The very next day after the body was found, Indonesian police pick up their trail. No lengthy search was needed. The couple is detained without a chase and without the kind of special operation one might expect in a high-profile case. And during questioning, what would become one of the defining features of the whole story begins. Heather's and Tommy's accounts diverge. Each describes events differently, and the roles in those versions are assigned differently. What one presents as the other's actions, the other interprets another way. Investigators log the contradictions and weigh them against the physical evidence. It's precisely on this divergence that the trial would turn. The court would have to decide whose version is closer to the truth and how to apportion responsibility between two participants in a single event. In general, though, the picture came together quickly for the investigation. There's a body. There's the method used to try to hide it. There's a couple who left the hotel and were found nearby. There are messages stretching back to the United States. Individual details were in dispute, but the overall outline was clear within the first few days. The case instantly drew international attention. The story of a body in a suitcase outside a luxury Bali hotel and of the victim's own daughter spread across the world's media. And ahead lay a trial where all these contradictions would have to be brought together into a single verdict. In 2015, the case reaches court in Denpasar, the administrative capital of Bali. It's tried under Indonesian law, in a legal system foreign to Americans, and that alone made the process difficult for the defendants. Prosecutors argue that the crime was planned, relying in part on the messages and on the circumstances of the trip. By their account, a series of deliberate steps led to the fatal morning. The prosecution names several motives at once, and they're all connected. The inheritance, that very trust fund, access to which depended on Sheila. The years-long conflict between mother and daughter, and Heather's pregnancy, against which a future without her mother's control might have looked different to her. The court placed the participants at different levels of responsibility. Tommy Schaefer is found guilty and sentenced to 18 years. Heather Mack receives 10. The difference in the sentences shows how the court assessed each person's role in what happened in that hotel room. For many observers, this very split became a point of contention. Some felt the victim's daughter had gotten off too lightly. Others felt the court had rightly recognized in Tommy the one whose actions led to the woman's death. But legally, at this stage, the question had been settled. The verdict closed the first Indonesian chapter. Both defendants went off to serve their sentences in local prisons, and from the outside, it seemed the story had an ending. The crime solved, the guilty convicted, justice restored. In reality, this was only the end of the first chapter. The life of the case itself went on, both behind bars and thousands of miles away, in the United States, where what had happened found its own, separate continuation. During the investigation and trial, Heather was carrying her pregnancy to term, and in early 2015, she gave birth to a daughter, Stella. You won't find this thread in any report from the scene of the crime. Under Indonesian rules, a small child stays with the mother, even in detention. So, Stella ended up beside Heather in the Karabokan Women's Prison, one of the most notorious penal institutions on Bali. The little girl spent the first years of her life in a cell alongside her mother. The law allowed this until roughly the age of 2. When that point came, the child was supposed to be handed over to care outside the prison walls. Custody was taken temporarily by a woman who had helped the family in Indonesia and agreed to look after the girl while Heather served her sentence. This part added a particular, deeply human edge to the case. A child born in prison to a mother, convicted in connection with her own mother's death, placed in a situation that's hard even to put into ordinary words. The child's fate depended on none of her own actions, and yet it was bound inseparably to other people's decisions. Later, a separate legal dispute would unfold around the girl, no longer in Indonesia, but in the United States, once Heather returned home. But that's a story for later. All of that came afterward, though. For now, in the mid-2010s, everything seemed frozen. 2 convicts serving their sentences, a child growing up between the prison and other people's hands, and a case that appeared to be closed. It only appeared so. In reality, in the United States, investigators' attention had already shifted to a third person, whose name had so far only been heard in the messages. His name was Ryan Bibbs, Tommy's cousin, who had stayed in the States. It was with Bibbs, according to investigators, that the details of the plan had been discussed. That same exchange of messages, which had surfaced back during the Indonesian trial, took on new legal weight in the United States. American law allows the prosecution of its own citizens for taking part in the killing of a fellow American abroad, and that opened the way to charges. In 2015, Bibbs is charged at the federal level, conspiracy to kill a United States national abroad. The wording matters. He's being tried not for what he did on Bali, where he never was, but for taking part in preparing and discussing the plan while he sat in America. In 2016, Bibbs pleads guilty. He takes a plea deal with prosecutors, which in the American system often produces a more predictable outcome than a full jury trial. And in 2017, the court sentences him to 9 years. The sentence became an important milestone for one reason. The case had, for the first time, truly stepped beyond Indonesian jurisdiction and begun speaking the language of a United States federal court. For those following the story, it was a signal. If American justice had reached the cousin who discussed the plan in messages, sooner or later the turn might come for the main figures, the ones who had been in that hotel room on Bali. And Heather and Tommy, for now, remained in Indonesian prisons. Only there, unlike in the American system, sentences have a way of shrinking, and that would soon bring the story back to the front pages. In the Indonesian system, sentences are reduced regularly. There are reductions for good behavior and for national holidays. And over her years of imprisonment, Heather benefited from this more than once. Her sentence slowly melted away. Another reduction came around a national holiday in 2021. Together, all these reductions had noticeably trimmed her original 10 years. And in October of 2021, Heather walks out of prison, having served roughly 7 years in total. Under Indonesian rules, a deported mother is not separated from a minor child. So, Heather leaves the country together with her daughter. They arrive in the United States, in the Chicago area, the very place where it all began. This return outraged many in America. For a sizable part of the public, the case had never truly been considered closed. 7 years for how the mother died seemed disproportionate. The release and the quiet return home only sharpened the sense that nothing had been finished. And behind the scenes, work was already underway. United States federal authorities were preparing their own charges, the very ones under which Bibbs had earlier been convicted. The logic was the same. The death of a United States citizen abroad falls under American jurisdiction, and participation in a conspiracy can be prosecuted at home, whatever sentence was handed down overseas. The time served in Indonesia did not close out the American part of the case for Heather, so the homecoming turned out to be not an ending for her, but a new turn of the screw. No sooner had she set foot on American soil and gotten caught up in a custody battle over her daughter than Heather came onto the radar of federal justice, far less inclined to shorten sentences than the Indonesian system. Several people laid claim to Stella at once, relatives from different sides and people close to the family. For a mother just out of prison, this became a separate, grinding front, and alongside the family dispute, a far more serious threat loomed over her. Federal authorities charge Heather in the case of her mother's death. She is arrested and held in custody in Chicago, in the very homeland she had returned to in order to start over. In June of 2023, Heather takes a plea deal with prosecutors. She pleads guilty to the count of conspiracy to murder her own mother. In exchange, some of the other charges are dropped, and the possible sentence is capped at the limit agreed in the deal. Among the motives, prosecutors once again name access to the $1.5 million trust. The same financial backstory that had been heard back in Denpasar also formed the foundation of the American case. The money that had been the subject of family quarrels for years remained the central motive even nearly a decade later. In January of 2024, the court hands down its sentence, 26 years. That's many times more than Heather had served in Indonesia. And here's the crucial point. The time she spent in an Indonesian prison is not credited to her in the United States. American justice ran its own case as something entirely independent. So the victim's daughter, already once convicted and released, received a second, far harsher sentence for the same event, but in a different country and under different laws. You'd think that would be the end of it, both main figures convicted, the cousin having served his time, the motive established. But the story, which began with a suitcase outside a hotel entrance, was preparing one more twist, and it had to do with the one who had remained on the other side of the ocean all this time. That's Tommy Schaefer. In Indonesia, his sentence, like Heather's, was gradually reduced for behavior and through amnesties. The 18 years handed down by the Denpasar court turned out in practice to mean a shorter imprisonment. In February of 2026, having served about 11 years, Tommy is released. He is deported and put on a flight to the United States, but he never returned home a free man. Right in international airspace, during that very flight, he is arrested. Upon arrival in Chicago, he is charged at the federal level on 3 counts: conspiracy to cause death in another country, conspiracy to murder a United States national abroad, and obstruction of justice. On some of the counts, he faces up to life in prison. The logic is the same as in the cases of Heather and Bibbs. For American justice, a foreign conviction is not the same accountability as under United States law. And now, the stakes for Tommy are considerably higher than they were in Denpasar. As of this telling, Tommy Schaefer's case in the United States is not yet over. How this final American proceeding will end is still unknown. The defendant is covered by the presumption of innocence, and the final assessment of his role in the new case is still for the court to give. The story that began on an August morning in 2014 with a suitcase outside the entrance of a luxury hotel on Bali, still more than 10 years later, has not reached its final period. Sheila von Wiese-Mack has long been gone. Her daughter is serving a second sentence. The cousin has already served his. And the legal echo of that morning still rings through courtrooms on 2 continents, with the ending of this long story being written right now.